This fall, we are running a webinar series of 3 webinars that focus on the role of nature in climate change adaptation. Our speakers will be diving more into the specifics on what this can look like. But first, here are some of the reasons why nature-based adaptation is a very important topic. Firstly, Indigenous wisdom teaches us the importance of learning from the land. In many cases, natural ecosystems hold the very same resilience that we seek to foster in our communities. Through nature-based approaches, building climate resilience can be done at the local level while we're also restoring community connection to the land. Natural approaches tend to be more cost-effective, both in terms of initial startup costs and in longer-term maintenance, as they're more resilient over time than some traditional hard infrastructure approaches. Natural approaches also offer some of the more holistic pathways for adaptation, with many co-benefits. Co-benefits refers to when an action has positive impacts in multiple areas, and this is the case with our nature-based adaptation options. For example, in addition to managing climate change impacts, nature-based adaptation can absorb emissions through carbon sequestration, contributing to mitigation efforts. They can also support biodiversity by creating habitats and protecting species and ecosystems. I'd like to also remind you that a thriving ecosystem also includes us. Increased biodiversity supports the production of healthy local food, which also supports employment. And local communities can be engaged through educational and recreational opportunities, which can have benefits for individual and community health. Ignoring nature is a really big part of what led us to our current challenges with climate change in the first place, so we should all aim to let nature lead us as much as possible and get back to a better way of life. Some goals for our webinar today, and that I would like you to keep in mind as you learn from our wonderful speakers that I will introduce soon, are we want you to gain a foundational knowledge of ecological networks, municipal planning and densification, methodology for protecting ecologically valuable areas and assets, as well as understanding future management for ecological connectivity in land use planning. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Alexandre Truchon-Savard and Stéphanie Paradis-Leger to start their presentation for you today. Take it away, Alexandre and Stéphanie.
Thank you very much, Madison. And thank you for the opportunity to present in French.
So if you're more comfortable asking questions in English, we're also comfortable in answering them in English, but the presentation will be in French.
So the presentation will be in French. And I am Alexandre Truchon-Savard. I'm the Director of Environmental Management for Dieppe since 2023. And with me today is Stéphanie, if you would like to introduce yourself. Hello, everybody. I'm a researchist in ecology with the Innov group, which is associated to the New Brunswick Community Colleges. So without further ado, because we do have time constraints, the presentation is titled Leading with Nature. So we're going to try and rethink the way we do urban planning, particularly in Dieppe. So a little bit of history about the city of Dieppe. It is on the Siknik portion of the Mi'kmaq territory, which means where the water drains. It's very appropriate. We have an enormous amount of wetlands and waterways that do drain into the watershed of the Petit Kodiak, which itself goes out into the Bay of Fundy. We also have a portion of the city that occupies the watershed for the Shediac Bay. So we are shared with regards to the airport. I could maybe point it out here with my little tool. So starting about here, we go towards the Shediac Bay. So a portion of the city of Dieppe is also in the Shediac Bay sector. A little brief history. So the colonial history of Dieppe started in 1730 with the first Acadian settlements who met the Mi'kmaq, who occupied the land since time immemorial. Following this, a few villages were founded. The town grew to attain a city of status in 2003. It had a considerable impact on the countryside. If we look, I'm going to delete the little arrow here if I can. So we notice here the airport, the Dieppe airport, which serves the greater Moncton area. And we see in 1986, the the Champlain Place, but also the beginnings of what we consider the industrial part in this sector. Residential neighborhoods that are starting to develop, and along this being along the main arteries, and then further down the road as we continue developing the city, which has been primarily conducted in forested areas or on abandoned farmlands. We notice a major impact on the terrain through development. Certain corridors and natural zones have been preserved. So we have a waterway. We have the Fox waterway, which flows southward to finally flow into the Petty-Kodiak River, which is a residual ecological corridor, given how the development constraints are a little more restricted there. And then we have Chartersville over here, and the riverside for the Petty-Kodiak River, which is a giant green space inside of Dieppe. So it's a bit the background that we're working with today. So with a growing population, which now hit in 2023 approximately 34,000 people, residents, and which is continuing to grow today in 2025. We see here the footprint of the development. So the 20 last years, we've seen an explosion in neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods throughout the city of Dieppe, which has had the greatest impact on the countryside, on the terrain. And in 2025, we are still at 1,600 residences being built, so we're still growing. It remains a constant trend. So Dieppe adopted in 2025 its new strategic plan, which aimed to have sustainability and prosperity goals. So to mix urban spaces and green spaces, and to highlight the importance of our green spaces. And this is done by the implementation of certain expectations. So firstly, what primarily concerns our service is understanding and enhancing our ecological network over the territory, which pairs with the densification of the area. So where do we have to densify with regards to our ecological network so that in 2035, Dieppe stands out as a bold city adopting innovative approaches to manage its development in a sustainable manner. And in order to achieve this goal, we looked to better understand our territory and look for opportunities to apply and implement this vision. And the opportunity presented itself with the extension of Dieppe Boulevard. So we have a main artery here, which is currently being built, and it will create a rezoning or reconsidering the zoning for over 1,100 hectares of land, all privately owned. So it's an exercise where we had the opportunity to rethink a little bit downstream what we were going to conserve while rezoning for our ecological sectors. So here I present to you the current zoning, which is quite restrictive. So RA here refers to a rural context. So what is allowed is one unit for every 5 acres of land. So that's very, very low density, very low development. And it's on this basis that we started the baseline criteria to define the type of or the level of intensity of development we could have in these potentially ecological zones. We also have a densification artery, RR, which is residential rural, which permits smaller lots along these main arteries that go towards Memramcook. One of the challenges here is the water pressure, but that's an entirely different project for the engineers. And another limit, we could say, to development. So we called CCNB-Innov to help us, guide us along the definition of an ecological zone in this sector. So I'll pass the mic over to Steph, who will explain a little bit the methodology they use to target the areas that we should try and protect or not rezone towards other uses other than nature-based. Thank you, Alex. So for this mandate to define an ecological network, an urban ecological network, we consider that in a context such as these two districts where we anticipate a fairly quick demographic growth, but still on a very, very low organization level territory and very little urban development. So it's an opportunity to plan urban plan differently, not only concentrate on economic criteria or demographic criteria, but it's also to highlight the importance of the natural areas that are most important on the territory. And we know it's a lot cheaper to protect natural areas that exist than it is to restore them. So for this project, we wanted to go a little deeper and a little over the normal guidelines for conservation by integrating not only conservation zones in the natural areas, but also to integrate multi-use zones, like for example, green spaces, green infrastructure or parks. So to start with, the first step was to look what were the natural areas already on the territory. So you can see with this map that there's a great amount of vegetation in these neighborhoods. So there's a lot of forested areas that are not excessively fragmented. And there's already certain elements that are already part of the ecological network. So the conservation zone with the coastal marshes close to the Petit Kodiak River, but also multi-use zones, so parks equally. And with regards to hydrology, we also were able to identify several waterways that weren't necessarily on the provincial maps. Permanent waterways, but also intermittent and ephemeral, which have a great ecological value. Also, when we went to visit the site, we noticed that there was a lot of wet areas that were not mapped out as such through the provincially available data. So we were able to go conduct a few more studies that were a little deeper in that area. Mostly the construction of the boulevard to delineate these wetland areas. We do have a little bit more of a timeline constraint, so we weren't able to go and create boundaries all over the territory, but we did look for various zones where we could find potential wetlands. So the approach that we chose for this particular analysis is an assessment based on ecosystem services. So it is beneficial that nature offers us for free to our communities. It has several advantages to take this approach. Primarily, it allows us to prioritize things that are based on the local challenges that the municipality faces. So by choosing ecosystemic services that are particularly critical for the delivery of municipal services, it also allows us to take well-informed decisions based on scientific data to justify the conservation choices with stakeholders. And there's also a certain validity, an economic benefit, demonstrating that the loss of ecosystem services can be very expensive for a municipality. For example, if a municipality loses the natural purification of their drinking water source, it can entail construction costs for a water treatment facility to the tune of several $1 million. So the ecosystemic services that we chose to highlight, we chose them by consulting municipal documents, regional sources, as well as a survey to the municipality to really contextualize the analysis. So I won't go too deeply into the details of our methodology because we'd be here all afternoon. But the highlights are that every ecosystemic service was associated to a series of criteria themselves derived. Like for example, water quality regulation. The four qualities or the four criteria are. Sorry, I can't see that. And each one of those are themselves derived from a measurable series of indicators. So on a scale of 1 to 5. So for those who've already conducted this type of analysis, it's a multi-criteria analysis that's fairly conventional. We then combined all these criteria to create a potential map to demonstrate the potential for each service on a map that I'm going to show you here in just one moment. And to really put into context the analysis of our local challenges, we chose to attribute some weighting to really highlight the ecosystemic services that are of highest priority for the municipality. So here are the aptitude maps that were produced, which demonstrates the potential of the two districts to supply each ecosystemic service. So the dark green areas would have a higher potential to provide these ecosystemic services. We also included certain data for climate projections, mostly for flooding attenuation in the context of climate change. We also wanted to identify the land-based constraints to development. So these are zones where infrastructure construction could be problematic. So for example, on high steep slopes, floodplains, or any other places that have regulation-based constraints. And the idea is to reconcile the uses of natural areas and the other and human needs. So these zones are opportunities for ecological conservation, and they can also become interesting corridors for connectivity. And it also has the advantage of redeveloping or redirecting development into zones that are less risky, which is particularly advantageous in the context of climate change. So we combined all these results to produce a global map, which represents both the ecological value, so associating, helping support biodiversity, as well as the inhabitants, and the zone allows us to identify sectors that are multifunctional, which means they're able to simultaneously provide several ecosystemic services, which are of high priority for the municipality of Dieppe. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we wanted to go a little over and above the conventional conservation modes. So in the scenario that we drew up for the municipality, we chose to integrate several elements. So to start with, we have nodes, which is the heart of the network, which will represent the zones that scored very high in the analysis. We also wanted to integrate elements to reinforce ecological connectivity on the territory, so to allow for natural movement of species and natural processes. And finally, we went to identify sustainable use zones, which would be spaces that would allow us to integrate other elements of the ecological network, so not only conservation zoning, and would allow various usage, all while limiting the impacts on the natural terrain. So we could put parks, green corridors, or it could be zones that are dedicated to development, but would be better. A better framework would be the implementation of regulations. So implementing sustainable methods. So we proposed four different scenarios based on different goals, protection goals. So to start with, the minimal scenario, which targets the protection of natural habitats, natural terrains, the most critical of those. Then we have two intermediary scenarios with goals of protecting 15%. The first is really based on the analysis, so on the ecological value that came out. The second represents uniquely the constraints to development. So we thought it was interesting to compare the two because the two do represent 15% of the overall territory. And finally, we have the optimal scenario, which has as a goal of 30% of conservation, which is used as a benchmark on a national level, generally speaking. So this would be functional natural areas to really support biodiversity on a long-term basis, as well as ecosystemic services for the community. So these four scenarios are propositions, or proposals, strategic proposals that will allow us to spur discussions amongst the municipal council. So it's not a delineation, a definitive delineation of the future ecological network. It's more a discussion that the municipality should have with its citizens to establish a common vision of the final outcome of this ecological network. So quickly, that was the first phase of the study, of this project rather. So the next steps, we want to improve our data, so validate our results, so go collect additional data. We also want to deploy the analysis to the entire municipality and improve it by integrating climate equity criteria, hosting more consultation and co-creation workshops, and integrating optimization models. And finally, the last step would be the planning of green infrastructure, which would be complementary to the natural surroundings. So thank you, Stephanie. As Stephanie had mentioned, the results, I can maybe come back to the four scenarios. These scenarios were presented to the municipal council last June. The council accepted the receipt of this report and gave us the mandate to work towards the integration of these recommendations into our local bylaws and policies. So we're working with the urban development services to find a balance between city planning for residential areas and commercial areas and institutional areas through this development zone. But that would take into account, firstly, the conservation areas and the ecological corridors. So what we're looking at, what will be presented to the public and to the stakeholders is a scenario that is around the 20% mark, which would be a combining of the two intermediary scenarios. So that's the direction we are headed. And since we know that 80% of the population lives in an urban area, it's not overly different in Dieppe. And our strategic plan orientation is to densify and allow mixed use zoning. So we need to work with the planning services to determine where should these densification corridors be located with regards to the ecological zones. So that is done through an exercise called a secondary plan. So it's a plan that will be inserted into the municipal plan, which is a legal document, which is registered and has to go through several consultations. The secondary plan targets a portion of the municipal plan, and that's how they're kind of stapled together. So our role is to work, as I said, with the city planning services to define the zones that really are stricter in conservation versus zones of ecological interest, sustainable use, and we're going to find the exact terms for these in the actual rules. We then need to present the whole to the stakeholders and develop a series of principles for authorized activities in these ecological zones. So what will be permitted as types of activities or types of impact that will be tolerated, or what measurable indicators have to be put in place to mitigate the potential impacts. And as I was showing on the map in the beginning, we see the current situation in Dieppe. Even though there are certain constraints to development, such as waterways and marshes are present, the impact is really usually felt on the limits of the conservation zones where it's stricter, and the border effect is very visible. So we want to limit this particular effect down the road for conservation zones that will be identified. And as Stephanie mentioned, we want to repeat this methodology for the entirety of the municipal plan. So the city of Dieppe saw a municipal fusion 3 years ago, and they absorbed new territories. And in addition, their municipal plan is from 2017, so we're going to revise it for 2027. And through this exercise, we want to expand the analysis to integrate the entirety of the community's territory. So management models that we're going to follow and we want to inspire ourselves from is the recent example of Mill Creek in Riverview, which was officially recognized as a conservation zone with high thresholds. And it was done through a partnership with Fundy Biosphere. And so we're looking at this type of model for some of the zones, which will be determined through the study. And so, in summary, I just want to remind you the importance of evaluating ecosystems before planning starts. So we really have an opportunity to do so here, and we seize that opportunity. One of the challenges, however, is to have the funding and policies in place. So what can we zone as conservation without risking being sued for expropriation? We see the case of Longueuil in Quebec, who is facing several challenges against their new conservation zoning. The law is different in Quebec. Here, we're targeting certain measures like land acquisition to compensate private landowners. So we need to develop a financial model that will take into account the need of purchasing a portion of the land that would otherwise be developable to maintain these ecological corridors. And as I said, we have to create a framework to define what activities will be permitted on these new zones. And I'd like to thank you all for your time. And we are ready to take any questions, should you have any.
Thank you so much, Alexandre and Stephanie. That was an excellent overview of your project. Before we jump into our Q&A, I'd just like to say that the government of New Brunswick is developing a climate change risk assessment, which will include new data, insights, and projections about the province's future. It's going to include overviews of the biggest risks for the region, as well as opportunities for climate adaptation. And the risk assessment is scheduled for public release in November, and we'll be sharing it when it's available. So please keep an eye on our newsletter and social media for more on that. And now we will jump into our Q&A session. Our first question, notre première question, is from Adrian Prado.
Very interesting work. Question for Stephanie. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you weighted and prioritized the ecosystemic services? Is there consultation involved with the municipality and or the citizens? Thank you. Hi, Adrian. So yes, we had consultations. We didn't have time to go to public consultation. At this point, it's something that we would like to do for the next phase of the project to better represent the values of the citizens. We did an internal survey with the municipal administration, and also there was work conducted through consulting municipal documents where they expressed certain goals with regards to municipal services. Thank you, Stephanie. Next question comes from Serge Dupuis. He's asking, how long after phase one of this work? It's about a year we've been working on that. Yeah, all in all, about 1 year. Which is why, the research was quite quick. We had to define the methodology, look for the correct data. So that's why we want to improve also for the next phase. But we did learn a lot from this initial phase. Thank you. And the next one comes in from Emma Poirier. Do you know how you're going to integrate the criteria for It's good. I missed that. We're starting to look at how we would do that, but there's a lot of data that were produced with regards to socioclimatic vulnerability linked with heat islands, flood risks, by integrating stats, demographic statistics, and economic statistics. So the idea would be to generate indicators, measurable indicators, to ensure equitable access to green spaces through the optimization of scenarios. So we're currently looking at all of that, and it would be to integrate these vulnerability indicators as one of the criteria in the elaboration of ecological scenarios. Also, to add on that, we are currently developing our management plan for the urban forest. And within that, there is equity calculation for accessing the forested areas, which is another element that could be added. It's the tree equity score, which is used more and more by cities in Canada and the US. So this is also something we could add to the measurables. Thank you. And Adrian is asking another question. What initiated or what started this work, and how did you start out? So there's three parts of the question. And was it an idea coming from the employees, or is it part of your land planning exercise? As I mentioned, our environmental service was created in 2023. So we started from there, and I took over the job. I worked with the various services to see how we can better highlight and protect our green spaces and natural spaces. That was the mandate of our service. So the idea was to identify through which process can we use to change our practices, and that was one that we quickly identified. And it's by contacting through webinars such as this that I saw the Innov services, and through discussions we saw that we had common interests for them to develop a new methodology and for us to have access to information and integrated into our urban planning, and that's how it was conducted. Thank you. Serge Dupuis is asking, was the consultation with landowners and developers in particular will be undertaken before or after the proposition or proposal of new rules? There's a first phase of consultation that's coming up. It's going to be a proposal, a scenario proposal, which will integrate at the same time the needs for residential development to accommodate future demographic projections, as well as the presence of these ecological zones. And there will be a certain retroaction from developers. We're expecting feedback from the developers, rather. We're expecting a lot of negativity from a lot of them, but the goal is to demonstrate that densification will still bring affordability that otherwise wouldn't have been there with the current zoning system, which is rural. Even we're going to say traditional zoning for a single family home. So we're working to create these densification projections to demonstrate that there's going to be a counterbalance in the urban planning, which I hope will offset or soften a little bit the message that the developers will be receiving. Luke Simard is asking, the analysis report, is it public? Yep. We are going to put it on our website shortly. And our address here is going to be shared at the end to the participants. You can write me an email. I can find a way to send it directly to you. It's way too big for an email, but we could certainly share it with you.
The next question is from Heather Lasconis. What is the percentage of private versus crown land that is involved in the region?
There is vast majority is private land. The rest is park land that is owned by the municipality. There's no crown land per se by the province or federal. But when it comes to the whole municipal area, then it's a mix of a lot of things. We have federal land, provincial land, and municipal land, as well as a lot of private land. But for the specific area that we evaluated, it's mostly private land, which is a challenge when it comes to accessing those areas for validation, field validation. We've had authorization to go on a few of them. We're working on getting more to validate some of the data that CCNB has generated.
Excellent. Charles Thibaudot
Do you know if the province is going to do an update of their maps to show more of our wetlands and marshes? From what I understand, when there's delineations that are done or updated, it is automatically sent to the province and they update the database, but they do not do it in a systematic fashion. We have contacted them, we've shared with them our initiative, and they're very interested. However, the validation of the new data requires on-the-ground work, important on-the-ground work, and so we're doing it piecemeal.
Heather Lesconis has a follow-up question. Was everything evaluated through mapping, or were there any boots on the ground surveys done?
So yeah, the only boots on the ground were those wetland delineation that we were able to squeeze in last minute and last fall before the winter. So obviously that comes with a margin of errors. We are aware that a lot of our data that we are using might not be precise, might be a lot of it is dated as well. So this is why it's important for us now to go on the ground and validate this data and collect better data as well for the next phase.
And one thing Stephanie hasn't mentioned is that we didn't just do delineation. We went through the full WESPAC, which is the Wetland Ecosystem Services Protocol of Atlantic Canada. And that provided more information on carbon storage, habitat quality, water retention, and so on. So I highly recommend that if you budget allows, if you have the chance to delineate, do a WESPAC. It's way more useful than just a delineation.
Yeah, good point.
Excellent advice. Thank you. Our last question for this session is from Jonathan Sharp. How does the province support or commit to this plan? Do they sign off on it through the overarching municipal plan process? And they're wondering this because what prevents a future council from simply ignoring the plan as future development proposals come forward?
It's a good question. There's different ways it can be, I would say, blocked. We've seen in Nova Scotia, Halifax region has their municipal plan denied by the province, partly because the restrictions around lakes were too high or considered too high by the province. So one way that we're looking at it is that we're not necessarily putting a blanket measure on all wetlands, on all watercourses. We're really focusing on the most important ones. So this is one way we think is a safer approach for not being denied by the province, but they will have to sign off on our municipal plan and the secondary plan. It is something legal that is registered through the province. And one thing that we are considering as well to secure the process is perhaps not completely zone conservation, but leave it as an equivalent to what is currently authorized through the rural zoning, which is very limiting. It's a highly discouraged form of development due to the not being financially sustainable. So this way, it's still not an expropriation, but more like a status quo that is still discouraging for development and really focusing on the more dense area that are going to be proposed.
Thank you so much. This project is so inspiring, and I think a lot of people are going to be taking away some ideas here to move their own municipal work forward. So Thank you both very much, Alexandre and Stephanie. We have just a few more things before we wrap up our session today. First, we would like to end with a call to action. So following everything that we've learned in this webinar, many of us are probably wondering what we can do as individuals to contribute to protecting nature and adapting to climate change. So we've got 3 simple things that can make a big impact. Firstly, explore and connect with nature in your community. It's important to build respect and connection with what we're trying to protect. Secondly, you can get informed about local environmental issues. Being informed will allow you to have conversations with others in your community and advocate more strongly for action on nature and adaptation. And lastly, being engaged in your community through volunteering or local events is a great way to meet people, build connections, and support ongoing work to advance nature-based adaptation. We encourage you to consider these opportunities to take action and invite others to get engaged with you.